Welcome to Investing in Impact, a Will Grow Africa podcast. This is a special season of Investing in Impact that is being shot at the sidelines of the International Development Innovation Alliance Summit happening here in Nairobi. And we are having a discussion right now here at the summit for this episode focused on global health financing. Who's filling the gap?
So what would you say is the single most promising new source of capital for African health right now?
So when I think of healthcare financing in Africa and where new sources of financing are coming, the most exciting one is seeing venture philanthropy or foundation funding being blended with private sector funding to fund healthcare solutions that could be commercially viable. And we think that that's a really promising source of financing just because of the volume of private sector financing that's out there.
I think the most innovative and newest form of capital for healthcare innovation is going to be around results-based financing. With the way things are going, with the shrinking funding available, we have to start thinking about incentives for result-based financing, be it development bonds, social impact bonds, where you know that it's a sure bet. When I put this kind of money, I'm assured about these results, and if these results are not met, I don't pay. That sounds like a win-win for development partners and other financial institutions. It will also help unlock private sector capital into the development world.
We want to explore in this conversation how emerging capital flows could impact public health priorities and health innovation pipelines. And joining us for this conversation, we have an awesome panel of two gentlemen who I trust will add deep insights to these conversations. And I will allow you to introduce yourselves, gentlemen. We can start off with you, David, and then we can move on to Efosa.
Thanks, Moses, and really great to be here with you and Efosa. My name's David Saunders. I'm a director at Briter Bridges. Briter is a data and intelligence company tracking funding flows into innovative businesses in Africa and across emerging markets. And we've been using that data in some really interesting ways over the last few days of this IDIA Global Summit meeting to understand where funding is currently working in terms of supporting ventures and where we can improve the way that we're approaching it to help more ventures scale.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Moses. Efosa Ojomo is my name. I'm at the Christensen Institute, where I lead the global prosperity team. And our work is really anchored in how the late Professor Clayton Christensen, his theories that he developed, how do we apply them to, in our context, the global development field to help create prosperity for as many people as possible. On the side, I teach a course called Entrepreneurship and Market Creation at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. I think the last couple of days here at the IDIA conference or summit has been great because it's really helped us reframe a lot of our thinking on what development is, what its role should be, the reality of what the sector is going through right now, and how we could think differently about leveraging innovations to create new markets that serve as many people as possible. So it's been great so far, and I'm very excited for this conversation with you and the good man David.
Great, thanks. So on today's episode, we're following the money. Where is it going? So for decades now, health financing has followed a very predictable pattern, but as you all know, there's been a shift. So there are new priorities emerging. And so the question of who's going to fill the gap, particularly in sectors like health that were largely donor funding, is a really important one to explore. And so this conversation, we want to draw on the work that both of you have done Efosa, you are very well known internationally for this idea of market creating innovations. Did I say it right?
You said it right.
And you have an awesome book that I'm very proud to have a copy of. Thank you very much. And I've started to read it. So what I want you to do is just to start to unpack for us this idea of market creating innovation. My first question to you is just to define it, first of all, and then to walk us through what it would look like in a health sector context.
Yeah, so very simply, market creating innovations transform complicated and expensive products, make them simple and affordable, so many more people in society can get access to them. They do require significant investment, not just in terms of capital, but in terms of the relationships that you have to build as the innovation diffuses across society. So perhaps the biggest example that we have across the continent would be the proliferation of mobile phones. The example that's much closer to home where we are recording this in Kenya is M-Pesa, mobile money, and how that brought the ability for someone who was, lower middle income to be able to receive and send money to others, right? And that infrastructure was an infrastructure that was only available or largely available to people who were wealthier with bank accounts and with internet banking and systems like that. When we start to think about it in the health sector, it becomes a little bit more challenging. But I am encouraged by sort of a new wave of innovators in the space that are really trying to figure out how they can get, whether it's drugs, so consumables, pharmaceuticals available to more and more people, or whether it's helping pharmacies manage their inventory and supplies, or whether it's leveraging technology to do more telehealth. And so if you look at Zuri Health as an example, that's an organization that's really leveraging technology to figure out how to get access to medical information to average folks, leveraging WhatsApp, leveraging telecommunications and the internet. Another organization is Maidawa, and that's a sort of a bricks and clicks type of pharmacy chain model where they're trying to figure out how to get access to medicines to more and more people. And those things are important because if you look at the continent as a whole, from the healthcare standpoint, I think we lose about 500,000 people a year due to the inability to get access to medicines. About 20-ish% of medicines in shelves and pharmacies are counterfeit. So another company, Sproxil, is helping help us figure out authenticity. And so you have organizations that are trying to do this, but those organizations, some of which I just mentioned, are not really traditional development type recipients of whether it's aid, grants, and that kind of thing. They're not traditional. And so those are examples of what market creating innovations would look like in the space. We need more of them. We need to scale them. And I think we just really need to rethink what is the purpose of development, right? And I'll leave you with a question, and maybe my man David could help me out. What is the purpose of development? Is the purpose of development to create dependence, or is the purpose of development to create development, right? And we need to wrestle with that. It's a simple question, but I think we need to wrestle with that.
Thank you. And, you've done a bit of my job, so I'm going to allow David to answer that question.
Oh, my God. I'm not getting a bit of your paycheck.
So having conversation with Efosa is always interesting because he sparks a few different thoughts. So I'm going to start with two thoughts before I answer that question. So the first thing you said, which was really, really interesting, was the idea of market creating innovations and technological diffusion. And I think the mobile phone, as you were saying, and really the low cost feature phone, right, and SMS connectivity is what we're talking about, how that transformed first payments across the continent and access to financial services. And what you see in terms of some of the solutions that we look at within the health space, like MBIMA and telemedicine and such, they've really ran off the back of that, right? Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, what other technological innovations have we had that had the same impact? And I was thinking about your question about funding flows as well. Mm. And solar panels and PVCs, and the fact that, you know, those got down to such an affordable price that they were able to be distributed, and more recently batteries. And then if I look at where funding has flown, you know, not just, as Efosa was saying, outside of the traditional development space, mm-hmm. so not necessarily budgetary support or necessarily support to NGOs to provide community health, it's gone to fintech, mm-hmm. mobile phone, largely mobile payments, and I would say some other types of devices that have been able to be adaptations of that type of technology. You know, those Yoko devices that they have in South Africa. Yeah. It's gone to renewable energy and solar panels. And most recently, it's gone to EVs, batteries. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I think that's a really interesting way to think about innovation in the continent, and not just in Africa, but abroad, which is, you know, what technologies have been diffused, and then what are the business models that we can build off the back of that. And I think that's the place where you have a lot of struggle with development, and you have a lot of struggle with dependence. Because if you think about the conversation we were having before, a lot of times the people that you serve with these business models aren't the people paying for them. Mm. And that's a really unique facet within health. Mm-hmm. So in a lot of ways, the challenge with the business model then becomes you making the beneficiary the product. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I was saying to Efosa before we got in this, the types of companies that have done that really well in the world, we don't love. Well, we kind of love Facebook, Google's. They've made us the products.
We use them.
Yeah, we use them. I was going to say, we become the products of that to some extent. So it's, you know, I think this is what gets so hard with business model adaptation we have is like, and particularly in the health space, is the person that ultimately uses the product or benefits from the product isn't necessarily the one paying. So isn't always the one you listen to in terms of giving feedback. So I just wanted to think about that for a second in the context of development versus dependence as well, is how do we ensure that the business models that we're building on top of these technologies are ultimately being the ones that beneficiaries and consumers actually want to pay for and use, not just the ones that we can get funded. Because to Efosa's point, we're always going to then be dependent on that funding. So I think that's the first kind of link that I have probably with what Efosa was saying. And then this term market creating innovations, I think it's really, really interesting as well within the health tech space. Because if we think about those two types of solutions that we just spoke about, where you have telemedicine solutions, which is really around, you know, expanding access. The other one that we've seen a lot of funding going to, M-Pharma, Mdawa, these solutions there, last mile infrastructure plays as well. And so a lot of what I see in terms of the healthcare space, a lot of what I see from our vantage point to Briter in terms of tracking funding is that health is at a space where we're just trying to build solutions that can expand basic access. And so I think that's kind of what the type of solutions that we're seeing emerging are, type of solutions we're seeing getting funding. So I think that's maybe a good bridge into discussing a little bit around those trends. But I think this idea that, you know, there's a difference between a technological diffusion and figuring out how to make a business model off of that. And I think where Africa has a major challenge is not so much the technologies that are available, but how do we adapt and build local business models that can best serve these communities.
And I think that's actually the whole point behind this idea of market creating innovations, isn't it, Efosa?
Yeah.
That actually you can innovate around the business model to the extent that that end beneficiary actually becomes the paying customer rather than, as you were saying, a product. Because, without that, then you end up likely to create this situation of dependence.
But that's where the funding fails. And that's what's so interesting, right? Is like, if you look at fintech, right? We're now looking back at fintech with rose-tinted glasses, right? I was there 15 years ago, in South Africa, where no one would come to my township tours to understand whether or not you could bank the unbanked, right? Now, all of a sudden, it's almost a given that M-Pesa works, that Yoko works, and things like this. And how could you think it ever was something uninvestable?
Yeah.
But those business models, they evolved during a period of lots of patient capital in a really favorable funding environment globally in terms of the macro conditions and the development conditions, right, over long periods of time. And those are the easy ones. Those are the ones which people were already using and were already paying for financial services in informal markets already. Now what we're saying, in terms of this is in a lot of health tech companies, and what I was presenting on this week, if you look at their journeys to even, let's say, scale or sustainable scale, these are 10 plus years. And do we have the kind of instruments and patience as funders that allow us to travel that journey with these ventures? And to your point earlier, in a macro environment that's very, very different it was in a much harder sector. And I think that's really where the financing today, I think, falls short. It's not that we don't have the technologies. It's the models that can allow for figuring out those business models over time, not necessarily having to shortcut that and either shutting down or going to a place where you become dependent on other types of funding.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I'm hoping that we find something that David and I disagree, just so we can spice things up for your listeners.
Yeah.
But if you look at what my man David has mentioned in the macro environment, right? You have an environment where governments across Africa are expected to invest in everything today, following their brothers and sisters in wealthy countries. Healthcare, infrastructure, defense, security, to build efficient bureaucracies and implement good policies and run, free and fair elections and on and on and on, provide social safety nets for the poor and so on and so forth. Well, one of the things I always ask people is, I think that's well and good, but the average expenditure per person across Africa, if you look at the government budgets divided by how many people live there, is $475. $475 per person per year. In Norway, it's about 40,000, about 30,000 in the U.S., maybe 25 to 30 in Germany, that kind of thing. Some countries, right? Ethiopia, Nigeria, very heavily populated. You're looking at $90 to $150. So that's one, right? So there is a difference between what an institution or an entity is supposed to do and what an institution or an entity can do. Now, I'm not going to absolve governments of many of the inefficiencies they have. But look, if we're trying to solve problems, then we need to look at the problem and say, do I expect this entity with the amount of resources they have to solve it? That's number one, right? It's a capital problem. And there's a paradox that happens when capital or any resource is scarce, right? Because we complain about corruption a lot. Well, when a resource is scarce, what do? We want to hoard. We want to keep. We want to keep for ourselves. Like, look at what's going on in global development industry today, right? I want to hold on to my job. I want to keep. And so those are natural phenomena that we should understand, not explain away as like nothing we could do about it, but we need to lean into them and understand them so that we can appreciate the difficulty of what solving the problem will take. It's not just institutional reform. We need better governance. Come on, man. We've been saying that since independence. If that was going to solve the problem, it would have solved it. Mm-hmm. What we need to do is slow down, understand how do systems really work? How do we incentivize people to make better decisions? The other thing about what David mentioned vis-a-vis those innovations, I understand some folks listening to the podcast might say, well, you're talking about solar, but how do we get that at scale? It's not as cheap, for industrial applications. We need the grid. But here's the thing with that, right? Look, Sure, I can run some models to show you how it's cheaper per kilowatt hour if you build a grid grid scale electricity infrastructure. There's a financial cost to that. There's a technical cost to that. There's a social cost to that. There's a political cost to that. There are all those costs that we're not factoring in when we talk about that cost per kilowatt hour. And so we keep waiting and waiting and waiting. And a lot of us, I'm gonna be honest, a lot of us who are on the other side of this, well, you sure I got 24/7 access to electricity. So I can talk about this all day. I can complain about this all day while that mom or dad doesn't have access. And they don't have access to medicines. They don't have access to electricity. They don't have access to products and services that can help them lead a better life. And so when you look at the impact of disruptive innovations, what happens is it starts off at the low end. It's cheap. It's not as good. The incumbents laugh at it. Oh, it's just a little solar panel stuff that can't even get you anything. Just a little feature phone. What's that? But over time, right, the entrants who bring that to market are incentivized to improve it, to add features, to say, okay, you could only send text messages, but now maybe we put a little layer on top. You send some cash, put another layer on top. You can, do some telehealth stuff and so on. And so I understand that, yes, that is not the same as me going to see my doctor, but that's grounded or anchored in the reality in which a lot of people find themselves. And unless we are willing to make the necessary investments, and this is beyond capital now, but the political investments, the capital, of course, financial investment, social investment, leverage our social capital to disturb the power structures and convince them we need to build this at scale. We need to influence the political economy to a level that we haven't seen since the Asian tigers and China revolutionized their economy. Unless we are willing to do that in a concerted effort, I mean, we got to, we have to solve real problems today.
Just one thing building on what you said there at the end, it's interesting, right? The story of M-Pesa in Kenya, or mobile money across Africa. It was not welcomed by the banks.
No.
I mean? So, M-Pesa initially started as an idea in South Africa, and the banks canned it, right? It took some real political leadership in Kenya from the Ministry of ICT at the time, who's now the ambassador to Belgium, to go out on the limb and take a risk to kind of allow it to exist, and the central bank governor to allow it to exist without regulating it, right? And the banks were not happy because they saw the future of that coming. So I think, a lot of the innovations we're talking about, I think as Efosa is talking about, do come up against protected interests that you do need to figure out how to disrupt. I think the second thing on what you're saying as well is if I look at the type of things as well, though, that are easiest to disrupt and easiest to upset the powers that be, it's those sectors where, users had already adopted something different. Yeah. So if are you from West Africa? Nigeria, right? So in Nigeria, everything runs off diesel. You know what I mean? In a country where it should have a massive amount of, and a lot of it's imported diesel, right? Yeah. Same thing with Zambia, right? So it was actually, you already had a decentralized power grid, right? Yeah. So solar could come in and be part of that quite quickly. Whereas in South Africa, the grid hadn't broken down yet. Yeah. It was all run through Eskom. Yeah. We didn't allow solar panels to participate as part of the system, as part of the grid, until it got so bad that we had more hours of the day with load shedding than without. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting, and I think this is an interesting bridge into the discussion around the development space. It's like change only happens when the cost of staying as is higher than the cost of change. And so, within the development space, me and Efosa were saying it has had a period where it has been able to go it alone, be relatively disruptive to each other. I think part of the session I had this week, and we're speaking a bit provocatively because this is a podcast, right? But You know this, Moses, in terms of Kenya. You know the number of accelerators we have here.
Sure.
You know the number of, I was telling folks that, you have one accelerator for every 10 startups in South Africa, right? You compare it to the SME sector, it's much worse. But now, because of this change that's taking place in the development space, because of the pressures that are now pressures coming on budgets, they're now being forced to collaborate and coordinate. And not just because it's a nice to have, but because the cost of not coordinating and collaborating is higher now than the cost of not doing it, which was the problem before. It was just much easier for you to do your own thing. So I think that's the funny kind of optimistic view of change that I think can come across this. And I think that's a really interesting trend that the kind of discussions the last 2 days have reflected, where people are like, okay, this isn't just something we want to be in a room talking about nicely. This is a reality that we now need to get to grips with, and we're willing to change what we do to accommodate.
Moses, I'm so sorry. Let me.
We're going to do this the whole time. Clearly, Moses was
Last one. He's not going to do it again. He's not going to do it again. Yeah. On David's points about the incumbents' fears, right? You go back to the pace of the banks, not in favor. I mean, that is a feature of every economy. Every economy. I mean, there's a reason, even in the wealthiest countries, you have companies who are close to the capital and lobby governments for certain rules and laws and so on, right? But the message I have for leaders of incumbent companies in Africa is, look, man, right now we're pushing on 20% of global population, barely 3% global GDP, as far as we know. Barely 3% of global trade, barely 3% of global foreign direct investment. We're insignificant from that standpoint.
Yeah.
I mean, based on those numbers. Now, somebody could say, oh, Africa, this, Africa. I'm just looking at the numbers, right? How significant are we? I look at consumption per capita numbers a lot. What do we consume vis-a-vis food, vis-a-vis energy, vis-a-vis healthcare? How many doctors per person? Data. Even when we look at mobile telephony that everybody has, if you look at number of minutes and cell phone usage per person per year, is again insignificant relative to what happens in other countries. Mm-hmm. What am I saying? There's nothing to be afraid of. We haven't created the markets that people can participate in. I can understand how a company in the U.S. and the U.K. and Germany, they want to be protectionist. They want to protect their customers. The markets are saturated. They're struggling. They got expensive cost structures. I can understand that. We need to create the markets first here. There is so much money to be made. You go to Ethiopia. The average Ethiopian is eating half a kilogram of chicken per person per year. Half a kilogram. The U.S., you're eating like 60 kilograms per person per year. Yeah. Global average is about 17. Africa is barely 10, I think. Nigeria, maybe 2 or 3, right? Kilograms. What am I saying, Moses? What I'm saying is, man, there's so much potential. There's so much opportunity. Let us figure out how to create these markets, work with the incumbent companies, work with the government, work with the development funders. Let's increase consumption per capita. Why do I care about consumption? Well, let me land the plane here and tell you why. If you slow down, Moses, and think about what is life, functionally speaking, what is life? Life is a series of struggles that are marked by consumption or non-consumption events, period. I wake up in the morning, I'm hungry. If I have access, I will eat. If I don't have access, I will not eat. I go about my day, Moses, and then I start to feel some pain in my head. Maybe I got a headache, or I start to feel some shivers. I got some malaria coming on. Okay. If I have access, I will consume headache medication, or I will not consume headache medication if I don't have access to the money, to the time, to the skill, my ability to maybe quickly diagnose what's going on with me. So life is nothing more than consumption or non-consumption. We consume our homes, our beds, our water, right, to take showers and so on. When you look at consumption per capita across this continent, it tells a story that hundreds of millions of people are living in what I call compounded struggle. Because if I can't consume medication to take care of my headache, I got to go to work like that if I have a job. And then that impacts my work. And then that impacts my attitude when I get home. That impact is just compounded struggle upon struggle. If I start to compare our consumption per capita versus other countries in the world, is insignificant. So can we begin to create markets that serve more and more people? This will take financial innovation. This will require ecosystem innovation. It will require social innovation, political innovation. It's not just a product market fit. Like, let me just figure something out real quick.
Yeah.
We have, it's an entire ecosystem approach. That's what it takes at this stage of development where we are. So it's a call to the entrepreneurs out there, but it's also a message to the incumbents. You ain't got nothing to be afraid of.
Yeah.
Credit per capita across Africa, $600 maybe. In the U.S., $160,000 per person of credit is flowing through the economy. $160,000. We got $600. We ain't got, what we crediting it? We ain't got no credit. $500, $600. We ain't got no credit.
Yeah.
And you know what is credit? Credit is oxygen. Credit is oxygen for an economy. I could borrow against the equity in my house, some assets here and there. That's oxygen. So let's do more. Let's not be afraid of these new startups are going to take my business. Maybe you ain't got no business. Apologies, man. Go ahead, Moses.
Actually, I really appreciate this conversation. We started out talking about how to finance innovation now in this context. And what's coming out is that we need to think not just about financing innovation, but we also need to think about all those other types of innovations you've talked about. And in the work that we've done at Vilgrow Africa and in one of the projects we call the Million Lives Collective, in partnership with IDEA, what we found is that we used to think about innovation demand and supply matching as a lock and key situation. So you have this problem and this solution and boom, you solve it. But what's coming out is that, the problems are complex. And I like the concept of compounded struggle because it brings us to this idea where you need integrated innovation to fix problems. And bringing that back to finance, David, you've done a lot of work in trying to understand financing flows on the continent. What kind of financing innovations do you think are needed? We've talked a lot about blended financing as a possible solution, but here in this conversation, we are saying that actually part of the reason why blended finance worked was because we were in another dispensation. Things have now changed. So what does that mean for us, for instance, in healthcare? So if you could just speak a bit to that.
So I've got some questions for you as well. One, it's called IDEA. Yeah. We keep saying it's IDIA. So it's ideas that's the branding of it. Okay.
Yeah, that's the branding. And it's kind of cute, right?
I like it. Okay. Yeah. I should know that working with them. But that's
good. It's good.
So it's a good idea. And I'm going to get some questions on the 1 Million Collective. But yeah, I think, I think the first thing is what we were saying before is the kind of environment in which funding towards ventures has changed quite a lot in the last 5 to 6 years, right? Gone from quite a irrational exuberance, let's say, not just in Africa, but around the world from 2019 to 2022. And then let's say irrational pessimism from 2022 to 2024. And you're starting to see some things kind of get to a bit of maybe rational exuberance, rational excitement over the last year as we're seeing that correction start to play out in the market. I think what we saw, though, over that period is that blended finance hasn't necessarily worked for all types of ventures. I think the when I look at funding into, let's say, the IDEA One Health framework that they have, which is this combination of climate and health, what you see is that about 50% of funding has gone to 10 ventures. And within actually the whole entire kind of venture ecosystem across Africa over the last 10 years, 33% of funding has gone, 1/3 of funding has gone to 10 ventures. So what I think blended finance has been really good in the impact space has been scaling up companies that have already made it to scale, or continuing to provide them with funding so that they go to new markets, they can, continue to sustain themselves. Where I think it's struggled quite a lot is the place where we find a lot of health tech solutions, which is between early stage grants and late stage blended finance, which is too small for DFIs and blended finance instruments, but it's too big for grants. And you need businesses starting to transition towards commercial kind of purposes. And when you look at the health tech space, I think if you remove Zipline, which we all probably should in terms of the funding environment, but it's interesting that it even experimented in Rwanda. Funding to health tech ventures has attracted about 5% of funding each year over the last 10 years. That sounds really low. That's still in the top 5 sectors that have received funding, because so much of the funding has gone into, renewable energy solutions and fintech solutions. And I think a big reason that it's struggled to scale is coming all the way back to the beginning of our discussion is the business models in health are really, really hard. Health is already a very challenging sector in the world, not just in Africa.
Yeah.
But in Africa, it's incredibly challenging as well because, as we were saying, the low income, some of the challenges with infrastructure. And it's also a sector that's very shaped by government and public policy. So you have a very difficult sector where government and the public sector plays a very big role. It's not just ventures that struggle within it. It's any type of business that's going to struggle within health. And, if we want to find market-creating innovations that can break through, like the Kashas, like the Bimas, these companies, like DM Pharmas, they've had a lot of patient capital that has backed them early on. Concessional funders have come in. If you look at the story of Kesha, which is a femtech company in Kenya, which is providing last-mile distribution in East Africa, you see that DFIs, Swede Fund, Fin Fund came in before Knife Capital came in, for example, right? Yeah. So I think, what is the type of blended, I would say we can't think of blended finance as an instrument or a deal. I think that's where it's fallen short, because what that infers is that one deal is going to fix it. We need to think about it as an approach on how we layer in different types of funding, different types of support along its journey to help more of these companies kind of progress through this infamous valley of death to get to scale. And I think that's really, really hard to do in the health space. And we haven't yet seen the amount of funders interested in that as we might have seen in something like energy or something like mobility. And I think that's a question I'm asking myself a lot is why is that the case? And what is then really unique about the health space that makes that so challenging?
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, look, if we look at financing vehicles, I think of it as just like regular vehicles, right? There are some things I would do with a sports car, or some things I would do with a sedan, with a minivan, a 18-wheeler truck, a big truck, right?
Yeah.
And if you categorize the different financing vehicles we have, vehicles that have been invented and modified in a lot of times other economies, responding to specific context issues in those economies, and then standardized, because that's what happens when an innovation comes in. These are innovations. Venture capital is an example. There was no venture capital in the way we understand it today 200-300 years ago. It was an invention that really took root after World War II in Boston. And this idea of long tail investing and getting significant returns. You invest in 10 or 20 things, and 1 or 2 home runs could make up for the entire portfolio, right? That was an invention that began to to be crystallized after World War II, and George Doiro in Boston brought a bunch of elites together. The point I'm trying to make here is these financial vehicles have somebody woke up, started creating them. They started to fix them and say, well, what are some tax laws we can implement? What some incentive structures we can put in place? And then they start to become standardized, I'd say 1970s, 1980s. And then when that happens, it gets locked in, and then you export it all over the world. And there's nothing wrong with that by itself, but to my man David's point, it's important for us to say, is this vehicle the right vehicle that I'm going to put these, whether it's startups, SMEs, these organizations in this economy and drive them to scale? Is this the right vehicle? Can this vehicle absorb all that's going on in this economy? Right. And I think that those are important questions. So even the terminology blended finance now, it now kind of means something. And I'm sad because it's such a, like most other, venture capital, it should mean literally venture capital. It should not necessarily mean asset light, anchored in digital, easy to scale capital. That's kind of what venture capital means now. Unicorn finding capital. That's what it means. You say what you want to say, but that's what venture capital means and is. Private equity. Private equity is distinct from public equities. It's equity. Me, you, David put our money together. It's private. So I'm not beholden to the same laws that public equities are, and we could get a little more frisky with it. Now, private equity means something. It's been standardized, right? And that's good. When we standardize things, they become a lot more efficient. It's like a language. There's no need to explain, right? I know what private equity is and means. I can communicate with people in Nigeria, in Ghana, in the U.S., because they understand. We're speaking the same language when we use those terminologies. What I would call for us to do vis-a-vis financing vehicles is really, it's not even so much create new ones per se, but it's just say, look, what are we trying to do here? This company, this organization is trying to increase access to, pharmaceuticals or, whether it's APIs in pharmaceuticals or whether it's access to medical information. So, whether it's a doctor, telehealth, or whatever, what are they trying to do? What does access look like today? What will it take to get access to 10x, 100x, and so on? Let's work backwards. What kind of capital do we need? What kind of milestones do we need to set? And then let's go solve it. But when we build these vehicles, before we understand the challenges, and I'm afraid we may be setting ourselves up for problems because we've designed a vehicle and we've said this vehicle has to work. And I studied computer engineering in school. I was not a very good one. I'm gonna let your listeners know. But, I have never seen a sedan car, a 4-door sedan, do the job of an 18-wheeler truck. I don't care how you design it. It's not designed for that. So are these financing vehicles fit for purpose? I mean, you tell me, Moses.
And that's actually going to be the last question that I want us to discuss before we close. If you were to speak to African governments, African financiers, what would you suggest for them in terms of how to mobilize local fit-for-purpose capital to create these market-creating innovations? What would your recommendations be?
First of all, if I were to speak to, let's say, African governments and people with capital, For the governments, I would first empathize, maybe even apologize, because word association, man, African government comes to people's mind, oh, inefficient, corrupt, good for nothing, whatever. And I would first empathize and apologize, because some of these people are our friends, our brothers, cousins. Not everybody in every African government is corrupt and inept and so on and so forth, right? That's number one. Number two, like I said earlier, man, a lot of African governments are severely under-resourced. And so I would empathize with that. But then I would also say, look, you are under-resourced, right? And so your job, first, second, third, and 100th, your job needs to be, how in the world do I mobilize capital here, today, right now? And if you look at what the Chinese did, there was a time, there's a book, How China Escaped the Poverty Trap by Yuan Ang. She talks about the job of Chinese, government officials was to actually go and bring in capital. So, think about your performance review as a government official is how much investment did you bring into your municipality, your village, your town, and so on. That's got to be the job. Capital is like oxygen. All this stuff we're talking about, it's not getting done without capital. So the job of these government officials needs to be, how do we bring in capital, right? And then one of the ways to do that is understanding what are the characteristics of capital. Capital is very, it gets homesick. It doesn't like to travel. It doesn't like to travel at all. If you look at global amount of capital available and then contrast that with global FDI, FDI is sitting around maybe a couple $1 trillion. We got about $100 trillion of global capital. Capital likes to chill, stay home. Mm-hmm. And so we have to understand that. So before capital travels, people need to it's relationships, it's trust. And so these governments, I think it would be really cool to have them not only visit other countries and lobby them to come and see what they're trying to do in their country, but really think, what does capital want from me as a government official in my own jurisdiction? What can I promise, right, within the bounds of the law? What can I promise? And then figure out a way to try to get folks to come in. Because once we start to get that, right, capital, once you create an infrastructure for capital to flow, it's like water. It just starts to flow. It doesn't even think too much, quite frankly. I mean, we say we can't attract capital. Look at the resource extraction industries in Africa. You're talking about we can't attract capital. Those sectors attract capital. Now things are changing a little bit now because it's become a little more difficult because the infrastructures we built over the past few decades is starting to crumble. But you say this country is corrupt, this country is this country is that, but then capital flows somehow to extract resources, whether it's gold, diamonds, oil, and so on and so forth. And so capital, it flows where we create that infrastructure. So that's what I would tell the governments. For the people with capital, if you're a global investor with capital, this is what I've started telling people. 7% of the global population lives on more than $50 a day. Yeah, that's $18,250 a year. Most of those people are in the U.S., Western Europe, Japan, Australia, that kind of thing. No matter how life goes for you, you've already won. Like you cannot lose. Like life, I can't lose. You can't lose. David, you can't lose. We are so connected to our social networks, our human capital, our education. And so we can't lose. And so my sort of thing is at some point we're all going to die. What are we going to do that's a little risque before we die? What risks are we going to take? What decisions are we going to make that are intelligent but are maybe a bit uncomfortable, not the norm, right? If I'm a global investor, I'm thinking, man, where are regions in the world that could really use capital? How do I How do I mobilize capital to go there? How do I learn about these places? Look, the returns are there, but the work is hard. I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, just invest and you'll get your return tomorrow and so on. We have to do our work. We have to be intelligent. We have to go in and understand the environment. Maybe it's not the enabling environment we have in other economies, right? And so what do we as investors need to do to get the environment looking good? That's what I would say for the African governments. Appreciate that you don't have a lot of resources. Do your best to attract capital, and for the investors, look beyond. Look beyond.
David, I want you to make a closing remark and focus on what you think an ecosystem level intervention would look like to facilitate what Efosa is talking about. And I'll give you 30 seconds to sort of build on what you were saying before you answer the question, because I see you wanted to say something.
Again, Efosa always says things that spark thoughts. And I think, the immediate thought I had is, and I think it relates to this, there is no bad capital. There's just bad uses. Grants do not wake up in the morning trying to undermine ecosystems, and I think,
That's a good one.
and I think this is something that, and we were talking about this before we started, we've created our own rules around these things. Venture capital must be this. Local capital must be that. Private equity must be this, right? And I think if the one good thing comes from the current shifts is we allow ourselves to unshackle from those rules. The Novo Nordisk Foundation, they run the Bioinnovation Institute, massive organization. I actually don't even think it's part of the foundation. I think it's part of their investment arm. Wow. They give their life sciences startups $2.5 million grants, 3 to 5 years to figure out the science. Why? I think the problem with grants is they're not big enough, and we're not, and they don't, and we're trying to cut them up into all these small parcels. And then we're saying, oh, you have a grant, you're not allowed another one of them. You're going to be a bad business as a result of it. So I think my first thing to align with him is there's no bad capital. And in the capital scarce environment, there's certainly no bad capital. And I would tell that to any government, and I would tell that to any investor as well. I think that's a really important starting point. I think the second thing in terms of your question, and particularly in the health space, right, where this is so hard and so challenging, I think the second thing in terms of what I'd say, in terms of an ecosystem intervention, which is quite hard to, what would I necessarily do to move the needle on this? It's a funny thing. I'd almost try to get out of the way. And I think this is a little bit of what we've been saying with the development and donor space, a little bit what we've been saying with the government space as well. Donors and development partners create their own regulations as well. You know this, if you received a grant, you spend more time reporting on the grant than you do using it to build your business. You know that if you're an ag tech company in Kenya, your biggest fear is the next agricultural policy that's coming from the government. I think I had an interesting conversation with a guy that works in the Ministry of Innovation in Nigeria. We had a cab together here yesterday, and he was saying the biggest improvement that he's seeing within the Nigerian government is they brought Boson. That's almost appropriate. He's the CC Up founder. As they brought them into the government, is they're bringing a mindset of either help or get out of the way. And I think, if I was going to say anything within development and governments and ecosystem interventions, is make everything easier.
Yeah.
Make it easier to get capital. Make it easier to use capital. Don't worry so much about the risks of failure. Because let me tell you, the risks of not doing anything are much, much higher than that.
That's correct. I would be remiss if I didn't put this plug in. You talked about ecosystems, and there's a group, a consortium called Investing in Innovations. That's a group that's funded by the Gates Foundation, MSD or Merck, Sanofi, a couple of other organizations. And what they've done is identified innovators in the health space that have the potential, the opportunity to scale. And I think Vilgro even supported and supports some of their efforts. And initiatives like that are gonna back these organizations with serious capital, and continue to back them. To David's point, we don't have this influx of capital where it's just sitting around not being used. What's capital scarce, man? And so initiatives like that, I do think can really move the needle. I am on the steering committee, so I just want a full disclosure there. I think it's a decent program.
Thank you very much. And true, we have participated in the program, and we've seen some great results from it. So I want to close this conversation by just sharing some of my takeaways. I think the first one is that, the biggest obstacle to change is cost. That's coming from you, David, that if it costs less to maintain the status quo, change will not happen.
Yes.
And then I really like your point, Efosa, speaking to the incumbents. There's nothing to be afraid of. If anything, what we are working with is too little. And of course, it makes sense that people want to hoard when there's scarcity. But your point is that there's really nothing here to hoard. What we should be doing is actually building. And if you're not building, get out of the way. I think that's a nice way to wrap it out. Get out of the way if you're not building. And for all of us who are in the ecosystem, I like as our rallying cry, let's make it easier for capital to flow to the continent. Yeah. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I really appreciate your time. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Moses.
Thanks, Efosa. Thanks, Moses.
I do appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.